I stared at my phone long after she hung up, the screen glaring back like an accusation. Her words kept echoing in my head, "I guess you don't care anymore." I couldn't move, couldn't even lower my thumb from the call button. Every instinct told me to call back, to explain, to beg her to not think I'd abandoned her, but something in the finality of that click froze me. The apartment felt impossibly quiet, even though I'd left the TV on. I could hear my own breathing, too loud, too sharp, each exhale heavy with panic I didn't want to admit. I tried replaying the conversation, searching for a hint that maybe she was joking, maybe she was upset at something else entirely, but there was nothing. Just that cold, almost clinical tone that I didn't recognize. I sank onto the edge of the couch and ran my hands over my face. The soft hum of the refrigerator became unbearable. Every memory of us together, the laughter, the late-night talks, the little routines I thought were ours, suddenly felt fragile, like thin glass I'd been holding without noticing. Part of me wanted to text her immediately, to pour out the guilt, the confusion, the fear that I'd lost her completely. But another part, a quieter, trembling part, kept me still. It whispered that maybe rushing in would make it worse, that sometimes the wrong move could destroy everything you're trying to protect. I didn't know then what had triggered her words. I didn't know that what she was telling the world, and what she was telling me, were two completely different stories. And I certainly didn't know how the next few weeks would turn my understanding of her, and of myself, upside down. We met in a way that felt ordinary at first, but somehow it wasn't. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the air smells of wet asphalt and a hint of something familiar, like the city itself was breathing. She was sitting at the corner table in that small cafe I sometimes went to alone, her hair plastered against her forehead, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea like it was the only thing keeping her steady. I remember thinking she looked untouchable, like she had her own gravity, pulling everyone else out of orbit. I found myself joining her without asking, an unspoken invitation in the way our eyes met. Conversation started slow, hesitant, and then it didn't. We talked about everything, books we'd read, movies that left us restless, dreams we were too scared to chase. Something about her laughter made the air thinner, like you could almost hold it in your hands. I didn't know it at the time, but I was already entangled in her orbit, and she in mine. Those early months were a mix of quiet mornings and chaotic nights, of arguments that flared up over nothing and silences that were comfortable rather than punishing. I learned the subtle cues, how a pause in her speech meant she was upset, how the curl of her lips could hide everything from amusement to sorrow. We built a world that existed just for us, one that sometimes made outsiders feel unwelcome, but we didn't care, and yet. Even then, there were cracks I chose not to see. Moments when she hesitated before answering, times when her smile didn't reach her eyes. I convinced myself it was normal, that everyone carried some hidden weight. Little did I know, those tiny fissures were already shaping the story that would soon make me feel like a stranger in the life I thought I knew. Looking back, the signs were there, scattered like crumbs I didn't notice until it was too late. At first, they seemed small, insignificant, like when she'd cancel plans at the last minute, shrugging it off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Or when she'd brush off questions about how she was feeling, saying things like, "I'm fine, really," with that faint tremor in her voice that made me pause. I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. Then there were the subtle contradictions in her stories, little details that didn't add up. She once told me she'd spent the weekend with her cousin, but I later saw a post online that suggested otherwise. At the time, I chalked it up to forgetfulness, to social media being misleading. I wanted to trust her, so I did. Other times, it was just a feeling, a tightening in my chest that I tried to ignore. Like the way she would sometimes look past me in conversation, as if listening to someone else. Or how she seemed to flinch when I reached for her hand, even though everything about us suggested we were close, connected. Each instance felt minor, almost meaningless, but stacked together, they left a residue of unease I couldn't quite name. I kept questioning myself, was I being paranoid? Overprotective? Or was there something I was missing entirely? I became hyper-aware of the gaps between what she said and what she showed, but I hesitated to confront her. Maybe I didn't want to uncover something that would break the fragile balance of our life. Even now, I realize how much easier it would have been if I had noticed these signs sooner. Not just to protect myself from confusion, but to understand the choices she was making, choices she was determined to hide from everyone, including me. It started with a text that seemed harmless at first: "I'm not feeling great. Don't worry." I remember staring at the words longer than necessary, feeling my stomach twist. I called her immediately, but she answered with that same clipped tone that had started to worry me, the one that always felt like she was holding something back. "It's nothing," she said. "Just a little tired." But nothing about her voice sounded tired. There was a hollowness to it, a quiet strain that made me grip my phone tighter. Over the next few days, subtle changes became impossible to ignore. She skipped meals she usually loved, spent hours alone in the bathroom, and her once constant energy seemed to drain from her like sand slipping through fingers. I asked again, gently, pushing just enough to make her admit she had seen a doctor. She shrugged it off, brushing me aside like I was overreacting. I tried to be there without being overbearing. I left her soup on the counter, sat quietly nearby while she read or worked, offered company without pressing questions. But each gesture felt met with polite resistance, and each refusal chipped away at me. There was a tension in the air I couldn't describe, like walking on glass. One wrong step and everything could shatter. At night, I'd lie awake replaying our conversations, dissecting every word, every hesitation. The more I tried to piece together what was happening, the less certain I became. And in that uncertainty, a gnawing fear started to grow, a fear that if I pushed too hard, I'd lose her trust. If I didn't push, I might be standing by as she let herself fall apart. Little did I know, even as I wrestled with this fear, that the choices she was making weren't just about keeping secrets, they were deliberately, intentionally shielding a part of her life from me and everyone else. I made the hardest decision of my life without fully realizing it at the time. I stepped back. Not because I didn't care, not because I wanted to leave, but because she asked me to. She had this way of looking at me, eyes steady, almost pleading, and saying, "Promise me you won't tell anyone. Not your friends, not your family. Just let me handle this my way." I remember nodding, feeling the weight of that promise settle on my chest like a stone. Every instinct screamed to push, to call a doctor, to confide in someone who could help. But she had drawn a line, and I had crossed too many boundaries already just by trying to help. So I stayed silent. I became a shadow in her life, checking in, offering quiet support, but never pressing. I left meals outside her door, sat on the edge of the sofa while she read, kept conversations light because any heavy talk felt like crossing an invisible barrier she had built around herself. At first, it felt like control, like I was respecting her autonomy. But as days turned into weeks, I felt myself unraveling. Guilt gnawed at me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every time her name came up in conversation with friends, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I felt trapped between my love for her and the promise I made. Each smile she gave me carried a faint tension, as though she knew I was silently screaming inside, trying to protect her in ways she couldn't see. And yet, in that quiet, careful distance, I thought I was doing the right thing. I convinced myself that respecting her boundaries was love in its purest form, that silence could be a shield. But sometimes, doing what's right for someone else doesn't feel right for yourself, and I was beginning to realize how heavy that kind of moral suffocation could become. Then it happened. The story I had tried so desperately to keep private exploded anyway, but not in the way I expected. I started hearing whispers first. Mutual friends asking why I wasn't there when she needed me, why I abandoned her during her illness. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, something that could be clarified. So I called her, gently, asking what she told people. She laughed, a light, airy sound that made my chest tighten. "I told them you were busy," she said, almost dismissively, "and that I was managing fine on my own." But it wasn't true. Somewhere along the line, the story had shifted, morphing into something I barely recognized. According to some messages and posts, I had vanished, left her when she needed someone most, and disappeared without a word. My stomach sank each time I read one of these claims, a bitter mixture of disbelief and helplessness twisting inside me. I tried reaching out to friends, explaining, clarifying, but each attempt felt like pouring water into sand. The narrative had already taken root, and nothing I said could stop it. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, judging, questioning, silently condemning. I became defensive even around strangers, wary of conversations that might circle back to her. I felt a profound, almost suffocating injustice. I had stepped back to protect her, to honor her wishes, and yet the world, our friends, our acquaintances, was treating me as if I'd been cruel, heartless, or indifferent. The strangest part was the loneliness. Even though I had been physically present, emotionally tethered, I felt utterly isolated. Everyone assumed my absence meant neglect. And in that assumption, the very thing I'd tried to prevent, humiliation, judgment, misunderstanding, had become unavoidable. Then came the message that felt like a knife twisting in slow motion. I had thought I knew the whole story, or at least, as much as she let me see, but this new piece of information made everything I believed crumble. A mutual friend casually mentioned that she had been seeing someone else while I was supposedly absent. I froze mid-sentence, the words echoing like they'd punched straight through me. My mind raced. Was this why she'd been so distant? Was this the reason she said I didn't care? I confronted her, voice tight with a mixture of anger and hurt. Is this true? I asked. She hesitated, eyes flicking away, and for a split second I thought I had been right all along. Maybe she really had betrayed me while I tried to respect her boundaries. My heart felt like it was being compressed in a vice. I imagined all the moments I'd given her space, all the sacrifices I'd silently made, and how they might have been meaningless if she'd been lying the entire time. Her reply was calm, measured, almost too calm. You think that's what happened? She said, almost teasing. I blinked. I don't understand, I stammered. She shook her head, a faint, sad smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You're making assumptions. You always do. Maybe you need to see things from another perspective. I left that conversation more confused than ever, my gut telling me one thing while my eyes insisted on another. The narrative I had been telling myself, the one where I was a victim of public misunderstanding, suddenly seemed incomplete. Almost naive. I felt betrayed, yes, but by what exactly? Her actions? My assumptions? Or the world around me that had already passed judgment? At that moment, I realized that what seemed like clarity was nothing but smoke. The truth was hiding, cleverly disguised, and every step I took to uncover it only led me deeper into a maze I wasn't sure I could escape. I couldn't shake the gnawing need to confront her one last time, to demand some clarity. It was late, the streets empty, and the city lights flickered against the wet pavement as I walked toward her apartment. I rehearsed what I would say over and over, trying to find the right words that wouldn't push her further away but would finally force the truth into the open. When she opened the door, she looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen her, but her posture was straight, guarded. She didn't invite me in immediately. Instead, she leaned against the frame and studied me silently, as if reading every thought I hadn't spoken. I could feel my own heart hammering, my palms slick with sweat. And I realized that I wasn't just angry anymore. I was exhausted, emotionally raw from weeks of second-guessing, isolation, and confusion. I need to understand, I said quietly, stepping closer. Everything. The illness, the messages, what people are saying, what's actually going on. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might finally break. Instead, she tilted her head and gave me that same faint, almost mocking smile. Do you really think the world's version of me is the real me? She asked. Her words hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. I opened my mouth to argue, to demand specifics, but the sentences stuck. My frustration battled with guilt. I wanted answers. But I didn't want to break the promise I had made. She watched me, calm, steady, and I realized she had deliberately controlled every interaction, every revelation, keeping me in a careful balance between trust and doubt. I left that night with no answers, only the weight of 1,000 unspoken things pressing against my chest. The truth was closer than ever, yet still unreachable. And the more I tried to force it, the more I felt like I was losing not just her, but the very sense of who I thought I was in this relationship. It took months before the pieces finally fell into place, and even then, the truth hit me like a tidal wave I couldn't have prepared for. I was talking to a mutual friend, the one who had always been closest to her, trying once again to understand why the story I'd lived in silence had spiraled into something so public, so distorted. And then it slipped out, almost casually, like it wasn't supposed to be revealed, she had refused treatment. I froze. The words didn't just make sense, they reframed everything. She hadn't abandoned me, and I hadn't abandoned her. She had made me promise, swearing that I would never tell anyone. She was fighting her illness in her own way, quietly, privately. Refusing to let anyone, including me, interfere. Every hesitation, every cancelled plan, every cryptic message suddenly aligned. The distance I had blamed myself for wasn't a betrayal, it was trust. I felt relief, yes, but it was tangled with a heavier, more suffocating weight. I had respected her boundaries, kept her secret, honored her wishes, but the world saw a very different story. Everyone I knew believed I had abandoned her, and there was nothing I could do to undo that. Even if I explained now, would anyone believe me? Would it matter, or had the narrative solidified too firmly to shake, and then the moral suffocation hit me fully? Could I have broken her trust to protect her reputation? Could I have told someone what was really happening? Maybe saved her from gossip, maybe even helped her in ways she refused, but at the cost of betraying the person I loved. I realized that whatever decision I would make, the fallout would be impossible to predict. For the first time in months, I understood the full weight of her choices, but it left me trapped between loyalty and morality, love and consequence, with no clear answer. The aftermath was heavier than I could have imagined. Once the truth came out, even partially, even just in whispers, I realized that some damage couldn't be undone. Friends and acquaintances had already made up their minds, and even though I now knew I hadn't abandoned her, the label had stuck. I found myself constantly explaining, justifying, retracting, only to feel more isolated each time. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope over judgment I could neither control nor escape. I also had to confront my own emotions. Relief, yes, but relief mixed with guilt, frustration, and an almost dizzying exhaustion. I had respected her wishes, honored her privacy, and yet the consequences of that respect were heavier than I could have anticipated. The pride I might have felt in being loyal was replaced by a hollow ache, because loyalty didn't erase the whispers or the assumptions. It didn't undo the way the world now framed my absence, and there was her. She never asked me to fix her reputation, and I never tried to impose it, yet I felt the weight of every misunderstanding pressing down on both of us. I wondered if she even realized the cost of her secrecy, not just to herself, but to me, to the people around her, to the delicate web of trust we built over the years. I thought about the promises we make, and what they really mean when life isn't black and white. Sometimes, keeping a promise can feel like a cage. And sometimes, breaking it can feel like a betrayal you can't ever take back. I didn't know which was worse, protecting her trust or protecting her from the consequences of that trust. And maybe, in the end, there's no simple answer at all. I still replay that choice in my head every single day. Sitting alone in my apartment, scrolling through old messages, photos, even the empty coffee mugs we used to share, I feel the weight of that promise pressing on me. I didn't leave her. I stayed quiet, I stayed loyal, I stayed present in the ways she allowed. And yet, the world thinks otherwise. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had broken that promise. If I had told someone, anyone, what was really happening, maybe the whispers would have stopped. Maybe the judgment would have been replaced by support. Maybe she would have received help I never even knew she refused. But would I have destroyed the one thing she had asked me to protect? Would the trust we had built over years have collapsed in an instant? There's no easy answer. Every day I feel the tension between loyalty and morality, between love and consequence, between keeping her secret and defending her in the eyes of the world. I have lived with the fallout, with the whispers, with the hollow weight of being misunderstood. And in that silence, I keep questioning myself. I wonder if anyone else would have done it differently, or if anyone else could have even made a choice at all. Because at the end of the day, there's a truth I have learned. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with action or words, they're fought with silence, with restraint, and with the unbearable burden of knowing that every choice, even the one made with love, carries consequences you may never escape. So I ask myself, and now I ask you, if someone you loved made a choice to handle their struggle privately, even to the point of risking their reputation, or even their life, would you honor that choice, or break the promise to protect them?